For the past decade, a single sentence has echoed through boardrooms, newsrooms, and government strategy meetings around the world. India is the next China. It sounds inevitable. Almost comforting. China's factories powered the world for 40 years now, as China slows. India is supposed to rise and take its place. But here's the uncomfortable question no one likes to ask. What if India isn't becoming the next China, but repeating China's most dangerous mistakes? Because when you strip away the headlines, the incentives, and the optimism, a troubling pattern starts to emerge, one that history has already shown us ends painfully. This is not a story about nationalism. This is not a story about pessimism. This is a story about how economic miracles are built, why they collapse, and why India now stands at the most dangerous moment of its transformation. And the real mystery isn't whether India can rise, it is whether India can stop itself before the same forces that lifted it begin pulling it apart. To understand why India is being called the new China, you have to understand what China represented. In the late 1970s, China was poor, rural, and isolated. Then it did something radical. It opened itself to the world. Factories multiplied. Foreign capital flooded in. Hundreds of millions moved from farms to cities. China became the world's factory not because it was cheap, but because it was organized, fast, and scalable. Now fast forward to the 2020s. China is aging. Wages are rising. Geopolitical tensions are pushing companies to diversify supply chains. And suddenly, global capital is asking the same question it asked 40 years ago. Where's the next place we can build everything? India looks like the perfect answer. A population larger than China. Younger workforce, democratic institutions. Rapid GDP growth, massive infrastructure spending, aggressive government messaging. Make in India the narrative writes itself. But history doesn't care about narratives. It cares about structures. And that's where the cracks begin to show. Unlike China, India didn't begin as a centralized industrial state. After independence in 1947, India chose a different path, one shaped by socialism, protectionism, and self-reliance. For decades, foreign companies were restricted, industrial licensing slowed growth. Bureaucracy replaced competition. This system avoided extreme inequality, but it also avoided scale. While East Asia industrialized aggressively, India stayed fragmented. Then came 1991. India faced a balance of payments crisis so severe it nearly ran out of foreign currency. The solution was painful but transformative. Markets opened, trade barriers fell, foreign investment arrived, private enterprise gained room to breathe. This moment was India's delayed entry into globalization. But unlike China's shock-and-awe transformation, India's shift was slow, uneven, and politically constrained. That delay matters more than people realize. Because by the time India truly leaned into manufacturing and exports, the global environment had already changed from the outside. India's rise feels explosive. GDP growth consistently among the world's fastest. Tech services dominating global outsourcing, smartphone manufacturing booming, record infrastructure projects, roads, ports, railways, a government openly courting global CEOs. Multinationals started relocating parts of their supply chains. Apple, Samsung, automotive giants, defense manufacturers, each announcement reinforced the same belief. India is China 2.0. But here's the hidden truth. India isn't replacing China, it's supplementing China. And that distinction changes everything. China didn't grow by being an alternative. It grew by being the center. India, meanwhile, is trying to industrialize in a world where automation reduces labor advantage, trade is weaponized, capital is more cautious, global demand is fragmenting. India is running the same race but on a completely different track. And that's where the pressure starts to build. Every economic miracle depends on three forces aligning at once. 1. Labor absorption. 2. Export competitiveness. 3. Political stability. Under stress, China nailed all three for a while. India is struggling with the first one already. Each year, India adds millions of young people to its workforce. But manufacturing job creation is not keeping pace. Instead, growth is increasingly capital-intensive, service-driven, urban concentrated. That creates a dangerous imbalance, because economic growth without broad employment doesn't create prosperity, it creates expectations, and expectations, when unmet, become political pressure. China solved this temporarily by flooding its economy with construction, infrastructure, and manufacturing jobs. India is trying something similar but with far less centralized control. And that's where the comparison starts to flip from hopeful to worrying as investment pours in. Familiar symptoms are emerging: rising inequality between urban and rural regions, overstretched cities and infrastructure bottlenecks, environmental stress, dependence on government subsidies to attract manufacturers, fragile supply chains relying on imported components. This is the same early stage fragility China experienced, but India has one disadvantage China didn't. India is more politically fragmented. Different states compete, regulations vary. Land acquisition is slow, labor laws are complex. What China solved with centralized authority, India must negotiate through democracy. That makes progress slower, but it also makes mistakes harder to reverse. And this brings us to the most dangerous phase of any economic rise, the moment when confidence outruns fundamentals. Right now, the world sees momentum. What it doesn't see is how fragile that momentum becomes when global demand slows, export-led growth hits limits, youth unemployment rises, political incentives shift from reform to control. China hit this moment in the 2010s. India is approaching it now. The real question isn't whether India can grow. It's whether India can change its model before growth creates pressures it can't manage. Because the same forces lifting India today may soon demand sacrifices its system is not built to make. And that's where this story turns darker. Every economic miracle reaches a moment when success stops solving problems and starts creating new ones. For China, that moment came quietly. Growth was still strong. Exports were still rising. Cities were still expanding. But underneath the numbers, something fundamental had changed. The system could no longer absorb the pressure it had created. India is now drifting toward the same inflection point. On paper, India's economy looks powerful, but look closer, and the warning signs start lining up, not dramatically, but persistently. Manufacturing growth exists, but not at labor-absorbing scale. Job creation lags behind population growth, informal employment remains massive, productivity gains are uneven, youth expectations are rising faster than opportunity. This is the moment where cause and effect become unavoidable, when a country grows fast but not evenly. The social contract begins to strain, and history shows that when that strain goes unresolved, economies don't slow smoothly. They fracture. China faced its reckoning with three powerful tools. 1. Absolute state control over land and capital. 2. A tightly managed financial system. 3. Political authority capable of enforcing painful adjustments. India has none of these at the same scale. That's not a moral judgment, it's a structural reality. India is a democracy with competing political incentives, state-level power fragmentation, judicial constraints, public resistance to rapid displacement. This makes India more resilient in some ways but also less flexible during crises. When growth slows, governments must choose reform or protection, redistribution or repression, long-term pain or short-term stability. China chose control. India will be forced to choose negotiation. And negotiation is slower than markets. One of the most dangerous similarities between India today and China before its slowdown is debt-fueled growth. Infrastructure spending is essential, but it has a dark side. Highways don't pay for themselves quickly, ports take decades to mature, industrial zones require continuous subsidies. China masked this pressure through state-owned banks and opaque balance sheets. India's debt is more visible and therefore more politically sensitive. As public and private debt rise, three things happen simultaneously. 1. Government flexibility shrinks. 2. Financial systems become fragile. 3. Growth becomes dependent on continued optimism. The moment confidence breaks, the entire machine stutters. This isn't hypothetical. It's exactly how China's real estate crisis began, not with collapse, but with denial. There's another assumption built into the next China narrative, that global demand will always be there. It won't. The world China industrialized into no longer exists. Western economies are aging, consumption growth is slowing, protectionism is rising. Supply chains are regionalizing. India isn't entering a golden age of globalization. It's entering a fragmented one. That means export-led growth has limits China never faced at the same stage. If India cannot generate enough internal demand, its external strategy becomes fragile, and internal demand depends on broad income growth, not just corporate success. This is where the story starts to resemble something darker than China. It begins to resemble middle-income stagnation. Failure doesn't mean collapse. That's the mistake people make. Failure looks like slower growth that never re-accelerates, persistent underemployment, rising regional inequality, political polarization driven by economic frustration. Governments prioritizing control over reform. China didn't collapse, it plateaued, and plateaus are dangerous because they create the illusion of stability while pressures quietly compound. India's risk isn't becoming poor again, it's becoming stuck, too rich to grow easily, too unequal to stay stable. Every country facing this moment tries the same fixes. India is no different. Incentives for foreign companies, manufacturing subsidies, startup booms, infrastructure acceleration, national pride campaigns. These help, but they don't solve the core problem. Because the core problem isn't investment, it's absorption. An economy must convert growth into jobs, skills, wages, social mobility. Without that conversion, growth becomes brittle. China delayed this reckoning with scale and control. India doesn't have that luxury. Look across history, and the pattern repeats. Japan in the 1980s, South Korea's near crisis in the 1990s. China in the 2010s, each followed the same arc. 1. Export-led boom. 2. Debt-fueled expansion. 3. Asset inflation. 4. Productivity slowdown. 5. Political pressure. India is not immune. The same forces are already visible just earlier in the cycle. History doesn't repeat because countries are foolish. It repeats because economic incentives don't change. Takeaway number 1. India is not the next China because the world isn't China's world anymore. India must invent a new growth model, not inherit an old one. Takeaway number 2. Speed without absorption is not development. If growth doesn't translate into mass employment and income, it creates instability, not prosperity. Takeaway number 3. The most dangerous phase of success is confidence. When optimism silences structural warnings, corrections become unavoidable. India's future is not predetermined. This story doesn't end in failure, but it doesn't guarantee success either. The deciding factor isn't GDP growth. It's whether India reforms before pressure forces it to. Because once expectations outrun opportunity, politics replaces economics. And when that happens, no amount of growth fixes the damage. If you found this perspective uncomfortable, that's the point. Economic history isn't meant to flatter nations. It's meant to warn them. If you want more deep, cause and effect stories like this, stories that explain why empires rise, stall, and fall, subscribe to the channel. And ask yourself this as you leave. Will India break the pattern, or become the next chapter in it?